Hello, Namaskar. This is Firstpost and you're watching Vantage with me, Palki Sharma. Donald Trump has hit top gear with his tariff plans. His latest target are cars. He has slapped a 25% tariff on car imports in America. What does it mean for car makers and consumers? How have stock markets and countries reacted? And what does it mean for India? We'll discuss all of that. Meanwhile, recession fears are on the rise. More and more experts warn of a recession in the US this year or next year. We'll tell you how that may play out for India. In Washington, the storm over the war plan leaks on Signal rages on. We'll talk about how safe these messaging apps really are. Also, what is Europe's grand plan to deter Russia? It's sanctions again. And they're preparing for war, asking all European households to stock an emergency 3-day survival kit. In Asia, Kim Jong-un has a new toy, an AI-powered suicide drone. India has slammed the American panel on religious freedom, calling it an entity of concern. In Africa's Niger, the junta chief has designated himself as a president for at least 5 years. In South Korea, the scandal of mass export of babies. And in Argentina, the president is at loggerheads with football clubs. He wants to privatize them. All this and more coming up. The headlines first. Multiple attacks rock Balochistan in southwestern Pakistan. At least 8 people have been killed. The assailants targeted bus passengers and took control of major highways. They also detonated an explosive in a busy market in Quetta. The attacks took place in multiple districts of Balochistan, including Gwadar, which is home to many Chinese infrastructure projects. Russian President Vladimir Putin to visit India soon. Moscow says preparations for this trip are already underway. In July last year, Prime Minister Narendra Modi had visited Russia and invited President Putin to visit India. This will be the Russian president's first visit to India since the war in Ukraine began in 2022. Israel's parliament passes a law to increase political control over judicial appointments, defying the massive protests against Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. The new law changes the structure of the Judicial Selection Committee, removing representatives from the Israeli Bar Association and replacing them with political appointees. South Sudan plunges into turmoil after the arrest of the first vice president. The opposition says this has invalidated the 2018 peace deal. It was a power-sharing agreement between the president and the first vice president, which ended its civil war. South Sudan is the world's youngest country. And the United Kingdom will ban ninja swords amid a knife crime crisis. The ban will come into effect from August. Possessing a ninja sword will carry a penalty of up to 6 months in jail. Knife crimes in England and Wales have been steadily rising since 2011.
Doing is a 25% tariff on all cars that are not made in the United States. If they're made in the United States, there's absolutely no tariff.
President Trump announced 25% tariffs against our auto industry. And this is a direct attack, to be clear.
Imagine you're walking into a car dealership. You've saved up money, you're ready to buy, but suddenly what you have is not enough. Prices are high, way higher than last year. So you ask the salesperson why, and they have just one word as the answer: tariffs. It's the word dominating headlines, business meetings, and political debates. It is the word of the year 2025, all courtesy Donald Trump. The US president has announced a new series of tariffs, 25% auto tariffs, that is tax on cars and car parts imported to the United States. The goal is quite simple. Trump wants to bring car manufacturing back to America. He wants to boost American jobs.
And we're going to charge countries for doing business in our country and taking our jobs, taking our wealth, taking a lot of things that they've been taking over the years. They've taken so much out of our country, friend and foe, and frankly, friend has been oftentimes much worse than foe. And this is very modest. And what we're going to be doing is a 25% tariff on all cars that are not made in the United States. If they're made in the United States, there's absolutely no tariff. We start off with a 2.5% base, which is what we were at, and we go to 25%.
Trump promises, quote-unquote, tremendous growth. But like most things in politics and economics, the reality is a little more complicated. First things first, how do tariffs work? These are taxes on imported goods. And guess who pays them? It is not the exporting country. It is the importers who pay this extra money. And businesses do not just eat that cost. They do not reshuffle an entire supply chain overnight. They just pass it down to the customers. So higher tariffs mean higher costs for you and me, and that means the consumers pay more. And who will these tariffs affect? First, the US car makers, the big three, Ford, General Motors and Stellantis. Their shares dropped by more than 3% today. The US imported around 8 million cars in 2024. That is around $240 billion in trade. It makes up for nearly half of the sales. Most of these car makers rely heavily on international supply chains, especially in North America. They produce vehicles in Mexico and Canada, and those operations now face disruption. Factories might shut down temporarily, jobs could be lost, and production costs will spike. So that's the first affected party, the car makers. The second affected party are the American allies, the likes of Mexico, Canada, Japan, and the EU. Mexico is the top supplier of cars to the US, followed by South Korea, Japan, Canada, and Germany. So Trump's move has sparked a massive backlash. Canada has called it, and I'm quoting, a direct attack on the country.
President Trump announced 25% tariffs against our auto industry. And this is a direct attack, to be clear, a direct attack on the very workers that I stood in front of, uniform workers I stood in front of this morning at the Ambassador Bridge, a bridge that is a symbol and a reality up until now of the tight ties between our two countries, ties of kinship, ties of commerce, ties that are in the process of being broken.
Japan too is outraged. The government was quick to respond. It is contemplating reciprocal tariffs. Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba says all options are on the table.
We are one of the biggest investors in the United States. In fact, we are number one. When we consider this, is it right that all countries are treated the same? We have been making this point and will continue to do so. We must consider the appropriate response to this announcement. Naturally, all options are on the table.
And the last party to face the brunt is the American consumer. This tariff money will come out of their wallet. Prices could rise by anywhere between $4,000 to $10,000 per vehicle, $4,000 to $10,000. So if you are eyeing a Japanese Toyota or a German BMW, be prepared to pay a premium. So these are the losers in Trump's trade war. What about the winners? Or maybe I should ask, are there any winners? Well, there could be one, and that is Tesla. It might actually come out on top here. Tesla builds most of its cars in the United States. Its factories are in California and Texas. That means it won't have to pay the new tariff on finished vehicles. Just look at the numbers from last year. The two best-selling electric vehicles in the US were Tesla's Model Y and Model 3. They were the best sellers. But this year, Tesla has been losing ground. Two other cars were racing ahead in sales: GM's new EV and Ford's Mustang Mach-E. Both of these cars are made in Mexico, so now they're going to cost more, which means Tesla will have an advantage again. And by a happy coincidence, the Tesla CEO is also Donald Trump's first buddy, Elon Musk. He was asked about this, about the advantage that his company now gets. And he said, with these new tariffs, Tesla won't be unscathed. For a change, he was not wrong. The company still imports some parts from abroad, which means the production costs will rise for them too, although not as dramatically as their competitors. So it is still a win for them. Which brings us to the question, what does all of this mean for India? Our auto exports to the United States are limited. In 2023, they were worth $1.5 billion. But some companies will feel the pain. Companies like Tata Motors, they do not export directly to the US, but they have a subsidiary called the Jaguar Land Rover. 22% of its sales are in the US market. So Tata Motors will be affected by these tariffs. Its shares were down by 5% today. Next question. What happens next? US automakers are scrambling, allies are furious, and prices are set to rise. This is just the beginning of a long and messy fight over tariffs. Will companies move production back to the US? Will consumers stomach higher prices? Will other countries retaliate? Will this lead to a full-blown trade war, or will Donald Trump take his tariffs back? At this point, your guess is as good as mine. The only tip is this: if you're in the market for a new car, buy immediately.
We've been ripped off by every country in the world, friend and foe. And I can do it the easy way or the hard way. The hard way to do it is exactly what I'm doing. I think this country is going to boom. And remember, Trump is always right.
Every day, the Trump administration stuns the world with a new trade fight, a new confrontation. It's classic shock and awe. But here's the thing. It is shocking the US system too. It is raising fears of a recession in America. A survey came out this month. It puts the chance of a recession at 36%. 2 months back, it was at 23%. So the risk has increased considerably. And this is not the only such assessment. Major banks have expressed concern, like Deutsche Bank. It says there is a 43% chance of recession in the next 12 months. 43% chance, Deutsche Bank. JP Morgan puts the odds at 40% if Trump imposes all the tariffs. And some experts are going even further. They say the possibility of a recession is as high as 60%, 60. Of course, Trump is playing down all of this. He says there will be no recession in the US. In fact, the president has become more vocal, more assertive about his denials. Last month, he gave an interview. He was asked if tariffs will trigger a recession in America. He did not rule it out. He tried to sidestep the question. He said the US is going through a quote-unquote transition. Now, this was a vague and evasive response, and it caused a stock market crash. US stocks plunged by over $1 trillion in just one day because of that remark. And after that, Trump's messaging changed.
Your comments the other day not ruling out a potential recession seemed to rattle the stock markets. The Commerce Secretary said there wouldn't be one.
Boom. Just so you know.
Just specifically on the recession.
Yeah.
Do you think there will be a recession?
I don't see it at all. I think this country is going to boom.
Well, what's a recession? The presidency is a boom. And he remains bullish on tariffs. He insists that they will boost the economy and make Americans rich. Even though the economic data tells a different story, inflation is set to rise. The US Federal Reserve has raised its forecast. This is America's central bank. It's also called the Fed. It expects inflation to hit 2.8% this year. The earlier estimate was 2.5%. Now, for an economy of America's size, this shift from 2.5 to 2.8 is quite significant.
You may have seen that goods inflation moved up pretty significantly in the first 2 months of the year. Trying to track that back to actual tariff increases, given what was tariffed and what was not, very, very challenging.
Growth projections have also taken a hit. The Fed expects the US economy to grow at just 1.7%. If you ignore the pandemic years, this would be America's weakest performance since the year 2011. And that's not a good headline to have. Plus, business confidence is slipping. Recently, America's top CFOs took part in a survey. CFOs, as you would know, are chief financial officers. 60% of them are expecting a recession this year. Another 15% believe it could happen next year. So a majority of CFOs feel that a recession is coming. That is the broad sentiment in the United States. What about the rest of the world? A recession in America will have far-reaching consequences. It would send ripples across the global economy. So the obvious next question is, how is India poised? Can India handle the shock of an American recession? Broadly speaking, it can. India is not completely insulated from the risks, of course, but it is among the least vulnerable in Asia. Let me show you some data. How much does the Indian economy depend on the US for exports? Just a little over 2%. Compare that to some other countries in the region, like Vietnam. 25% of Vietnam's exports go to the US, so the risk for Vietnam is quite high. A recession in America could mean less business for exporters in Vietnam. Same with Taiwan, Thailand, and Malaysia. They're all more vulnerable. More than 10% of their exports go to the United States, so even the possibility of a recession is bad news for them. Comparatively, India is better off. And what about the Indian stock markets? If the US slows down, Indian markets will gain. That is the assessment of Bernstein. This is a wealth management company. It argues that the Indian economy is driven more by domestic factors. It does not depend on the behavior of US consumers. So largely, Indian stocks may rise. Some sectors may be hurt, like IT services and pharmaceuticals, because these are among India's biggest exports to the United States. But on the upside, they're working on a trade deal, India and the US, on a free trade pact that could insulate exports from Trump's erratic economic policies. Because remember, a trade war cuts both ways, and as of today, it is hurting Trump's America more.
He had no clue. We can't let this happen. I said, we'll look into it. There was no classified information.
Clearly classified information.
Had this happened to me, I would have walked my resignation in immediately.
The number one used device or app.
It's been 3 days since Signalgate, the war plan leak. It happened on March 24th. It is the 27th now, and the storm is still brewing. Donald Trump is trying his best to push it under the rug. The White House is doing everything, downplaying, deflecting, denying, but it's only growing bigger. We've been telling you about this. The Houthi war room chats on Signal. Trump's top officials discussed plans to bomb the Houthis in Yemen. This discussion was on a messaging app called Signal. A journalist was added to this group chat by mistake. His name is Jeffrey Goldberg. He read the complete war plans, then he exited the group and broke the story. He wrote an article in his magazine. So while bombs fell on the Houthis in Yemen, a firestorm erupted in Washington. Trump has been in damage control mode since then. The Democrats are demanding answers. Even some Republicans are raising eyebrows. Trump's team is giving contradictory statements. Marco Rubio and Tulsi Gabbard seem to be on the same page. They accept the mistake. But Pete Hegseth says otherwise. He insists that no classified information was shared. Have a look.
Obviously, someone made a mistake. Someone made a big mistake and added a journalist. Nothing against journalists, but you ain't supposed to be on that thing.
Nobody's texting war plans. Well, I noticed this morning, out came something that doesn't look like war plans. And as a matter of fact, they even changed the title to attack plans because they know it's not war plans. There's no units, no locations, no routes, no flight paths, no sources, no methods, no classified information.
So Trump's Secretary of State admits that there was a mistake, but the Secretary of Defense says no war plans were leaked. Now this seems very confusing. This political storm also brings in focus a larger issue, that of messaging apps like Signal and WhatsApp. Are they safe? More importantly, should they be used for classified government communication? Let's start with the basics. WhatsApp is the most widely used messaging app in the world. It has more than 3 billion users. You heard that right, 3 billion. Then there is China's WeChat, followed by Russia's Telegram, and somewhere down the list is Signal. It has just 70 million users worldwide. But Signal has become the go-to app for the Trump administration, and the reason is quite simple. WhatsApp is owned by Meta, a private entity founded by billionaire Mark Zuckerberg. Trump and Zuckerberg have a history. Trump was once banned from Facebook and Instagram. This was over the Capitol Hill riots in 2021. Of course, now there's a thaw between the two sides, but a trust deficit remains. WeChat and Telegram are out of the question. They're owned by the Chinese and the Russians. So we're left with Signal. It is owned by a US-based non-profit. And American intelligence agencies rate Signal higher than WhatsApp. They say it has enhanced security features. But all these apps have one thing in common, and that is end-to-end encryption. You may have heard this term before. It is basically a security setting. It ensures safe transfer of digital messages. End-to-end encryption means only the sender and the receiver can read these messages. No third parties can access the chat. Third parties like your phone company or your internet provider, they cannot read your messages. It is encrypted or locked end-to-end. Seems like a safe way to communicate, right? But it's not as safe as they promise, because end-to-end encryption is not foolproof. Let me tell you why. The least secure way to communicate is through text messages. They can be intercepted and seen by any hacker. Encrypted messages on Signal and WhatsApp are slightly more safe. Even if they're intercepted, they cannot be read. But if your phone has already been hacked, your encrypted messages are compromised. Whether you're the sender or the receiver, if your phone is hacked, your messages can be read by the hacker. So just because Signal protects messages in transit does not mean it is fully secure. All that a hacker needs to do is compromise your phone. Because in today's digital world, there is a key for every lock. The messages can be decrypted using special software. And you may have heard of that too. I'm talking about Pegasus. Pegasus is a spyware. It was developed by an Israeli cyber arms company. Not only is it widely available, but it's also widely used. Both autocratic and democratic governments have been guilty of this. Pegasus has effectively surpassed firewalls. It can even hijack iPhones. So governments use it to snoop on threats. And Pegasus has compromised WhatsApp in the past. We have data from 2019. At least 1,400 WhatsApp accounts were exploited by Pegasus. And this is just one example. This is just one spyware that we know about. There could be hundreds of them. The thing is, for most people, messaging apps are safe. End-to-end encryption does its job fairly well. But if powerful governments want to bypass it, they very much can, and they have. That may not be the case with the Houthi war plan chats. That seemed more like a chat for college group projects, where the admin does not know who is in the group. But for a country that claims to be the biggest superpower, that was definitely shoddy work. And it proves one thing: no matter how safe technology may be, it will always remain vulnerable to human error. Now let's turn to Europe. A grand meeting took place today in the French capital, Paris. It was a summit to support Ukraine. The meeting was co-chaired by French President Emmanuel Macron and Britain's Prime Minister Keir Starmer. This was not a European Union meeting because, as you know, the UK is out of the EU. This was a different group. They're calling it the Coalition of the Willing. It's all the European nations that want to support Ukraine and help it secure better terms against Russia whenever a peace deal is finally struck. This coalition is Europe's way of making a lot of noise. So it will finally get a seat at the negotiating table, because so far it has been kept away. You know that the US is overseeing ceasefire talks. It is talking to both Russia and Ukraine, and these talks are taking place in Saudi Arabia. So Europe is nowhere in the picture. They're not involved, and they do not like it one bit. So this coalition of the willing is Europe's attempt to stay relevant. And that's a fair ask. After all, Europe has been part of the Russia-Ukraine war since day one. It has poured billions into Ukraine in the form of both humanitarian and military aid. Europe has provided jets, tanks, arms and ammunition. So obviously it wants to stay involved, especially at this crucial stage when peace could be within grasp. So wanting to stay relevant is not the issue here. The problem is the way Europe is doing so.
More support for Ukraine to make sure Ukraine is in the strongest possible position, both now and in further negotiations. Second, complete clarity that now is not the time for lifting of sanctions. Quite the contrary, what we discussed is how we can increase sanctions to support the US initiative to bring Russia to the table through further pressure from this group of countries.
No lifting of any kind of sanctions until Russia will stop this war. And I think more pressure on it, more packages of sanctions. This is important. The second point, as you said, Keir, that new packages to strengthen Ukraine, and we heard of some of the leaders' new packages. We are very thankful to all the leaders.
That was Starmer and Zelensky just after the summit got over. And what was their brilliant idea? More of the same. Europe's grand scheme is to stay the course. More sanctions, more aid to Ukraine, more of the same old, same old. We all know how brilliantly that has worked for 3 long years. I'm sure Russia is ready to give up any second now. It will take just one more sanction or one more missile from Ukraine. That will show Moscow. Look, Europe's heart may be in the right place. It is not wrong to keep supporting your friends. But doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result, that is ludicrous. And speaking of ludicrous, there was this gem by Macron.
We have agreed that the British Prime Minister and I will mandate our Chiefs of Defence Staff to send a Franco-British team to Ukraine in the coming days. This team will work closely with our Ukrainian partners, who have also approved this mechanism, to prepare, across all areas, the structure of what the Ukrainian army of tomorrow will look like.
The UK and France will apparently help reorganize Ukraine's military into the army of tomorrow. Well, they should be hoping that Ukraine does not need an army tomorrow, because peace should prevail. But instead, it is the same old strategy, try and bolster Kiev's forces so that Moscow suddenly becomes afraid. The fact is, the time for pressure tactics is over, because frankly, Europe does not have its main backer anymore. Trump's America seems more in sync with Russia than Europe, but the Europeans refuse to take the hint. They keep hoping that Trump will come around. Look at this.
It's very clear that everything we agree for the future should be with the United States a part of it, and that also means that it shares responsibility with us for the security of Ukraine and for peace and security in Europe. That's why we are in NATO. And it is also clear that it is very important that there are such American security guarantees.
Talk about tone deaf. That is Olaf Scholz, Germany's outgoing chancellor, the one who lost his election and is waiting to retire. He is telling Donald Trump to take responsibility for protecting Ukraine. And then he brings up NATO. When Germany is one of the nations struggling to contribute its fair share, how can someone be so out of touch? In fact, that is a problem in a nutshell. The Europeans refuse to see the big picture. The old world order has fallen. Donald Trump has rewritten the rules and Europe has been left behind. They need to stop with the sanctions and saber rattling. They need to get out of the past, out of their comfort zone. That is the only way Europe will become relevant again. And the only way they will get their place at the talking table. So Europe is getting ready for war and it wants its citizens to prepare too. Brussels has issued guidelines for all 450 million Europeans. 450 million people across all 27 member states. Every household has been asked to maintain a survival kit to stock up on things like bottled water, canned food, a torch and basic supplies like toilet paper. This stock should last for at least 3 days. That is the instruction. It is part of a new European strategy for preparedness.
Today's threats facing Europe are more complex than ever, and they are all interconnected. The battlefields in our pockets, our phones, our computers, our power plants, or banks, or supply chains, or raw materials, and in the media, the social media we consumed every day. These are all battlefields, and they are being weaponized to threaten our European way of life and our democracies. And the EU has two ways of responding. We can stick our head in the sand and act like it isn't happening. Or we can look these threats scarily in the eye and say, this is the reality we are facing and we will prepare.
Brussels wants Europeans to be ready for anything. A war, cyber attacks, extreme weather events like floods or wildfires, even a major disease outbreak. Europeans must be self-sufficient, at least for the first 72 hours of any crisis. That is the key message of Europe's preparedness plan. Top EU leaders are urging people to act on it. They're suggesting keeping an emergency bag ready at home.
It's Ajalabi. Welcome to What's in My Bag Survival Edition. My document in a waterproof pouch, a must in a rainy Brussels. Let's talk about lighting. I have a flashlight and, of course, the light. Turn. And my special friend, a Swiss Army knife, and of course some cash. In the middle of a crisis, cash is king. A charger and a power bank, because a dead phone is a dead end. This is everything you need to survive the first 72 hours of a crisis. Speaking about being prepared, the EU is preparing its strategy to be sure that every citizen is safe in case of crisis. Be prepared, be safe.
Believe me, that's a real video. Hadja Labib shared it on X. She is the European Commissioner for Preparedness and Crisis Management. She is the driving force behind this plan, and it does not stop at survival kits. In future, the EU wants to have a National Preparedness Day. They haven't locked a date yet, but the plan is grand and exhaustive. Preparedness will become a part of the school curriculum. Europe feels it's an absolute must. Although most people would consider these measures extreme. They're asking 450 million people to keep emergency kits at home with stockpiles of canned food and toilet paper. Is Europe really heading into a war, or is this just fear-mongering? The trigger, of course, is the situation in Ukraine. Europe increasingly feels that it is at risk, that the threat of a conflict is higher. Different member countries are working on their own plans too, like France. This summer, all French citizens will get a manual, a survival manual, outlining clear and detailed steps, like what to do if a war or any major crisis breaks out. In fact, Belgium already has a website for its citizens. It has a list of items, things that every household should keep in an emergency pack. Germany and Poland have gone a step further. They have asked families to upgrade cellars, garages, or storerooms as bunkers. Homes in Poland are already doing this. One EU leader compared this to accident insurance. Listen to what they said. You want to be prepared and you want to minimize the damage, the costs, the suffering that you might go through. They make it sound rather so normal, but it's anything but normal. Stockpiling of critical supplies and turning basements into bunkers is not normal. People do this when a war looms. Governments are supposed to protect their people to keep them safe from harm. Instead, the EU is handing out an instruction manual with doomsday predictions, telling Europeans how to survive on their own for 72 hours when crisis hits. This is not insurance. This is leaving people to fend for themselves. The fact is, Europe's security landscape has changed. For decades, the bloc relied on American protection, but now that guarantee is fading. US President Donald Trump has issued repeated warnings. He does not want to pay for Europe's security, and Brussels was not prepared for this. Without the United States, Europe lacks a credible deterrent. The only solution is to raise defense spending well beyond 2% of their GDP. That is what NATO prescribes for its members. 2% of the GDP should be spent on defense. A lot of members don't meet this figure, but now they're pulling up their socks. Sweden, for example, it wants to raise defense spending significantly to as high as 3.5% of its GDP. This is a welcome step. But it must be taken by the whole bloc. Europe needs stronger defenses, not safety manuals. You've heard of ChatGPT, Grok and DeepSeek. These are all artificial intelligence platforms. They use supercomputing to mimic human behavior. People often use AI for research or for homework. That's what most people do. But Kim Jong-un is not most people. He is the leader of North Korea and he is installing AI into kamikaze drones. These are drones that find a target and explode. They're highly lethal. Equipping these weapons with AI is taking it to the next level. It's like giving the drone its very own brain. It can think, calculate, and act without human intervention. Imagine a weapon that does not need any human input. And Kim Jong-un wants thousands of these. So what exactly is he preparing for? Our next report digs deep.
There's a new sheriff in town, and it's none other than North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. Taking inspiration from the Hollywood thriller Top Gun, Kim Jong-un was seen wearing a leather jacket as he inspected his country's new weapons. Surrounded by his generals, the North Korean leader was seen standing next to a massive reconnaissance drone, and that was just the tip of the iceberg. Kim then inspected several other smaller drones. These were test-fired in his presence. The attack drones were seen hitting their targets. Then Kim Jong-un made some big announcements. He said that all new drones will be powered by artificial intelligence and that thousands of AI-powered kamikaze drones would be made. We all know that the use of AI has become rampant, from children using it for school projects to grandmas using it to learn new recipes. AI has made its place in almost all sections of society, even the military. The US, Russia and China are already using this technology for their weapon systems, and Kim Jong-un doesn't want to be left behind. So what exactly are these AI-powered suicide drones, and how are they different from normal ones? Largely, all suicide drones are controlled by humans. Operators launch the drone and then guide them to their target using cameras or lasers. But that will change with AI. It's like giving the attack drone its very own brain. After it's launched, it can gather data on its own, recalculate its flight path, and act without any human intervention. It's the ultimate fire-and-forget weapon. This means it won't be vulnerable to electronic jamming because there's no electrical feed guiding it, and this will give them a much higher success rate. So AI is going to make suicide drones extremely lethal, which is why Kim Jong-un wants them. But that's not all that North Korea revealed. A new airborne early warning aircraft was also brought out from under the covers. It will be used to track any incoming aerial threats. However, military experts say it's a Russian copy, or could even be a Russian plane that's been repainted as a North Korean one. South Korea's military has already called out North Korea's propaganda.
If you see it, you will know that it appears to be quite dull, heavy, and vulnerable to interception. We believe that the internal devices and components may have connections to Russia, and the model itself is an upgraded version of the one that North Korea previously owned.
Relations between Russia and North Korea go back to the 1950s. But the two nations have upgraded their ties recently. Russian President Vladimir Putin calls Kim Jong-un his trusted friend. The two even signed a strategic defense agreement last year. The two countries have pledged to defend each other in case of a war. Reportedly, Pyongyang has already sent 11,000 troops to fight in Ukraine, and now Kim Jong-un has sent an additional 3,000. Seoul believes the North Korean troops are gaining vital combat experience, which is increasing tensions in the Korean peninsula. With the new AI-powered suicide drones and battle-hardened soldiers, it looks like Kim Jong-un is sticking to his guns and readying for war.
Let's return to the United States. New president, new administration, new policies, but the same old habits. Uncle Sam has a habit of poking his nose where it does not belong, and he's doing it again with its annual report on religious freedom. It's compiled by the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. It's a federal commission of the U.S. government. They call themselves independent and bipartisan. But they're funded by American taxpayers, and they have one job: publish reports on what they call religious freedom. And how do they define that? They say religious freedom is the right for everyone to practice their religion or to not practice religion at all. So this body compiles a list of global incidents where religious rights are under threat. Then they publish an annual report. It is submitted to the White House and the US Congress. Clearly, the report is important for Washington. They use it as a stick to beat up countries they do not like and countries they want to put pressure on. But why am I talking about it tonight? Because it mentions India again. This report, the latest one, has at least 3 pages dedicated to religious freedom in India. It says, and I'm quoting, in 2024, religious freedom conditions in India continue to deteriorate as attacks and discrimination against religious minorities continued to rise. That's not all. It mentions the ruling party in India, the Bharatiya Janata Party or the BJP. It also names Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi. Listen to this. The report accuses the Indian Prime Minister of hateful and disinformed rhetoric against Muslims. It further says that the consecration of the Ram Temple in Ayodhya in Uttar Pradesh led to increased attacks against religious minorities in 6 Indian states. It categorically mentions Uttar Pradesh, Uttarakhand, Chhattisgarh, Manipur, Gujarat and Rajasthan. 5 of these states are ruled by the BJP. What else does the report say? That Sikhs, Christians and Muslims are being targeted by the government of India. And then the report has 3 recommendations for the Trump administration. First, sanction the Research and Analysis Wing or RAW, that is India's spy agency. The US panel says RAW is targeting minorities abroad, particularly the Sikh community. That's number 1. Recommendation number 2, review the sale of weapons to India. Halt the sale of the MQ-9 Reaper drones. New Delhi is buying 31 of these drones for its eastern borders. The US body wants to halt this deal. Do you know why? Because it feels that these drones will be used to persecute religious minorities. It makes no sense. Using drones to persecute minorities. And finally, recommendation number 3, designate India as a country of particular concern. This designation is given by the US to countries like China, Pakistan and Iran. The report says, club India with them. New Delhi has, of course, rejected all of this, calling it, and I'm quoting, a biased and politically motivated assessment. The official statement from India says, and I'm quoting, the USCIRF's persistent attempts to misrepresent isolated incidents and cast aspersions on India's vibrant multicultural society reflect a deliberate agenda rather than a genuine concern for religious freedom. Such efforts to undermine India's standing as a beacon of democracy and tolerance will not succeed. In fact, it is the USCIRF that should be designated as an entity of concern. New Delhi is spelling the obvious. The report is utterly biased. It is a poor hit job attempt backed by Washington, and it must be called out with some facts. This is data from 2024. 3,268 hate crimes were reported in the US in 1 year. Anti-Muslim hate crimes increased by 18% in 28 cities. Anti-Semitism was up by 11% in 35 cities. And anti-Asian slurs rose significantly. Clearly, minorities are not safe in the US, and this is just the hate crime data. We are not even counting the mass shootings. There were more than 500 mass shootings in 2024, so no one is safe in America. But they want to lecture others. The thing is, Washington is free to publish such reports, but they should start with the US, with the plight of minorities in their own country, because if the US saw what is going on in the US, they would invade themselves to free the US from the US. Since 9/11, Muslims in America have endured heightened surveillance, profiling and hate crimes. The Council on American Islamic Relations documented more than 8,000 complaints from Muslims in 2023 alone. These range from employment discrimination to outright violence at mosques. Then there's the rise in anti-Semitism. It saw a 140% surge in 2023 compared to the previous year, with synagogues vandalized and worshippers harassed. But Washington's reports do not talk about any of this. What it does right now is just sanctimonious posturing and wielding a calculated political tool. Our next story is from Africa, from Niger in the west. The country made global headlines in 2023 because of a coup. Niger's military overthrew their democratically elected president in the name of national security. It's been 20 months since then. Security is still down in the dumps. Terror attacks are more frequent than before the coup, and the country is heading down an all too familiar path. The leader of Niger's military junta has declared himself president. His unelected term will last 5 years at least, because apparently the term is flexible. It's the same story that keeps playing out in Africa and beyond. Here's our report.
These are scenes from Niger in July 2023. The military was orchestrating a coup. They were detaining the democratically elected president Mohamed Bazoum. The people on the streets were thrilled. They were angry at their government for failing to put an end to terrorist attacks in the country, and for allegedly being pawns of France, Niger's former colonial overlord. So, the people of Niger thought military rule would be better. That's why they were celebrating the coup. Niger's military is certainly no pawn of the French. That part seemingly held true. But on the terror front, the junta has proved to be worse than the old Bazoum government. Terrorism has been on the rise, which was to be expected, because the junta got rid of a coalition of Western forces, anti-terror forces led by the French and the Americans. The move was great for optics. It helped to reinforce the anti-colonial narrative, but fewer boots on the ground was bound to help terrorism thrive. It seems this was the price the people of Niger had to pay, to be free of French and Western soldiers in their backyard. Niger's military junta has been hyping this up, appealing to nationalist pride and finding excuses for their abject failure to deal with terror. They keep blaming everyone else for their failures: France, the US, even other West African countries, members of the regional grouping ECOWAS. Niger's junta says that all these external forces are working to undermine them. Simultaneously, the junta keeps expanding its own power. They made a fresh power grab yesterday.
From this moment on, the President of the Republic of Niger, Head of State, Army General Abdourahmane Tiani,
the junta chief, Abdourahmane Tiani, was officially declared the president of Niger. The coup leader is now an unelected president, and he will remain so for 5 years. At least, that's what they're saying right now, because this unelected presidential term is apparently flexible.
The duration of the transition period is set at 60 months from the date of its promulgation. This duration is flexible depending on the country's security situation, the burden of the reform, and the agenda of the Confederation of Sahel States.
The junta chief's term depends on a number of factors, including what happens in the neighboring countries Mali and Burkina Faso. All three nations, Niger, Mali and Burkina Faso, are ruled by military juntas, and their juntas have banded together into a group called the Confederation of Sahel States. They all seem to be following the same playbook too. First, they orchestrate coups, and then they promise to return their countries to democracy within a short transition period. Niger's junta chief did this too, back in August 2023.
Within this framework, the stakeholders who will be invited will set about formulating concrete proposals within 30 days, leading to 1. Define the fundamental principles that should govern our transition. 2. Define the priority of the transition, which should last no longer than a few months.
But somehow, the junta leaders never follow through. They all find excuses to extend the time frame. And the junta leaders somehow all get sworn in as president. It's the exact same playbook, all over West Africa, and the world in general. In Myanmar, the junta took control in 2021. They have been clinging to power there since then. They keep postponing elections too. It's the same story almost every time a military takes control via a coup. So Niger's case is not unique. It's just the latest example of what happens when you let a military dictatorship take root.
What comes to mind when you think of South Korea? K-pop, Korean skincare, cutting-edge technology. South Korea has a sleek, modern image. A place that thrives on innovation, a cultural powerhouse shaping global trends. But there's another side to this country, one that barely makes the headlines. Now it is out in the open, and it's a massive adoption scandal. You see, South Korea is one of the biggest exporters of children to the world. You heard that right. It is the world's biggest baby exporter. Since the 1950s, more than 200,000 Korean babies have been adopted overseas. 2 lakh. These adoptions were mostly in the US and Europe. It started right after the Korean War in 1953 when South Korea was impoverished. It was one of the poorest countries in the world, so adoption was a way to deal with this poverty. Parents gave up their children. Many of them were abandoned, so they were put up for adoption. But soon it became a multi-million-dollar industry. Here's what reports say. South Korea earned between $15 to $20 million every year just from international adoptions. And this system was run with little oversight. And as we now know, a shocking degree of corruption. In 2022, a commission started looking into this. 3 years later, their findings are out, and it is shocking to say the least. Records were falsified, babies were taken without consent, and the entire system was more about profits than protection. Here's how it worked. Private adoption agencies ran the show. There was no government interference or oversight. These agencies relied on money from adoptive parents abroad. They would charge anywhere between $3,000 to $4,000 per child. Plus, there was airfare. Also, a $1,450 adoption fee. So the more babies they placed, the more cash they made. And that pressure to keep up supply led to some seriously shady practices like fake birth records, coercing mothers to give up their children, and kids taken without consent. In the last decades, the adoptees, that's the children who were adopted, have filed hundreds of petitions. They suspected that something was amiss with their adoption story. So this investigation looked into 100 such cases, and 56 of them were confirmed victims. These were children whose families were torn apart by the scandal. Some even had their identities swapped. And what happened to these babies and children afterwards is an entirely different story. Most of them went to 3 countries, the United States, Sweden, and Denmark. Sure, some did end up in loving families and homes, but many others faced neglect. Some were physically and sexually abused. Some of the adoptive parents were later deemed unfit, but the adoptions went on. And that is because South Korean agencies did not care. All they really wanted was the money. This went on for decades. In recent years, Seoul has tightened adoption laws. It has cut down on inter-country adoptions. But that does not erase the damage done. The Commission wants the government to apologize. So far, there's radio silence. The question is, can South Korea own up to its past while maintaining the polished, high-tech, trend-setting image? Because right now, the disconnect is glaring. This is a nation that exports cultural excellence. It must reckon with the fact that it was also exporting its own people without their consent. Our last story tonight is about Argentina. Football here is not just a sport, it's a religion, it's an identity, and it's the path to greatness for many impoverished families. Take Lionel Messi, for example. His father was a steel factory worker. His mother worked as a cleaner, yet he started playing at a local football club. That is where his talent got recognition. Argentina's football clubs are community institutions. They are owned by the members. They give back to the community. But Argentina's president wants to privatize them. His name is Javier Milei. He wants the clubs to become profit-making machines. Why is that a problem, and will Argentina fight back? Our next report tells you.
Long before Lionel Messi lifted the World Cup, long before Diego Maradona's famous hand of God, long before these two became the goats of football, Maradona and Messi were just kids, playing around in tiny neighborhood clubs, kicking around a worn-out ball in the dusty fields of Buenos Aires and Rosario. And that's where this story begins. Argentina's football stars don't just appear out of thin air. They come from grassroots community clubs, Los Clubes de Barrio. These places are more than just football pitches. They are lifelines. They keep kids off the streets, away from bad influences. They give them a sense of purpose. These football clubs are owned by the people. They are run by the members, and they are built on something deeper than money. It's passion. You don't buy your way in. You must belong. The community clubs are run as non-profit civil organizations, unlike the English Premier League or the La Liga. They are not privately owned by billionaires and investment funds. Instead, members elect a president and the board. They contribute to the club. These clubs are deeply intertwined with their local communities. They reinvest earnings back into infrastructure, youth development, and social programs. But now, Argentina's President Javier Milei wants to change all that. His plan is to privatize these clubs, to turn them into corporations and let investors take over. If he gets his way, the heart and soul of Argentine football won't belong to the people anymore. It'll belong to whoever's got the deepest pockets. Now you may be wondering, why does Milei care so much about football clubs? Well, it's simple. Milei believes in the free market. And to him, football should be no different from any other industry. If foreign billionaires want to pump money into clubs, why stop them? Why not turn them into profit-making machines? That's the logic. And on the surface, it may be appealing, but here's the problem. Look at what's happened elsewhere. England's Premier League may be swimming in cash, but ticket prices are through the roof, and clubs are now playthings for oil-rich billionaires. In Argentina, football is more than just a game. So letting corporations run the show could tear the sport away from the very people who built it. And people are fighting back. The Argentine Football Association is dead set against privatization. Most clubs are too. Fans have taken to the streets. They say football is not for sale. Even some club presidents are reluctant to open that Pandora's box. Courts have even blocked one such bid. But Milei isn't backing down. His allies are already laying the groundwork, testing the waters. Take Estudiantes de La Plata. It is one of Argentina's most historic clubs. They recently signed a deal with American businessman Foster Gillette, the same Gillette family that once ran Liverpool. So it's a foot in the door. And once that door is open, there's no telling how far privatization could go. This isn't just about football. It's about what Argentina values. These clubs aren't just factories for future superstars. They are community hubs. So what happens next? Well, the fight's far from over. The clubs are resisting. The fans are furious. And even as political divides run deep, there's a rare sense of unity on this issue. If history has shown us anything, it is that football in Argentina belongs to the people. And they won't give it up without a fight.
Elon Musk's X looks like a comic strip today. A new viral trend has taken over the internet, or rather, the AI has. It's called Ghibli. It's inspired by the classic Japanese animation studio. OpenAI launched a new image tool It can turn real photos into Ghibli-style art. Users jumped in right away. They wanted to see themselves in this hand-painted look. Now X is flooded with dreamy images. Even old memes are getting a makeover. Some are adding their own twist, and the internet is not complaining. And now it's time for Vantage Shots, images that tell the story. In Turkey, Erdogan's crackdown has not even spared Pokemons. Pikachu was seen fleeing the police during the protests. In Washington, D.C., a child slipped through the White House fence and was escorted out by the Secret Service. And colorful aurora lights light up the sky over Finnish Lapland. Finally, we're taking you back in history. On this day in 1977, the world's deadliest aviation accident took place in Spain. Two Boeing 747 planes collided in the middle of a runway. It killed 583 people. Heavy fog and miscommunication have been blamed for this collision. We're leaving you on that note. Thank you for watching. We'll see you tomorrow.